To kick it off, I'm going to ask somebody who really has a perspective on this, a personal perspective on this, to come and tell us what God's been doing in his life. A year ago or so, within the last year perhaps, Ron was up here, Ron Kennedy, and he told you the story of his coming to Christ. But in the last couple of months, something else very significant spiritual has been happening in his life. So I'm going to invite Ron Kennedy up here now and let him tell you his story. So Ron?
Good morning. Again, Woody's asked me to come up and share my story with you, and I'm just going to tell you the way that God kind of laid it out to me and how he brought me to where I came to the decision I came to about a year ago. I grew up in a Christian home all my life. We'd go to church every Sunday morning, but yet Monday through Saturday, I'd see a different story kind of lived out in our home. You know, growing up in a Christian home like that, where I didn't see a relationship kind of lived out in the home from my father and my mother, it became easy to kind of adopt that same type of characteristic as I came into my teenage years and into my early adulthood. I'd gotten to the point where I was going to church every morning, going through the rituals, going through the routine, but Monday through Saturday it was a different story. I would live a different life. And I really didn't give much thought about how I was living my life until I got older and I started having children of my own. And when I started having children of my own, I started thinking, man, do I want my kids to have that same distorted view of Christianity that I had, where they just get up on Sunday mornings, go through the motions, and then they don't see it lived out in me throughout the week. And that's exactly what was starting to happen. You know, we'd come to church. You know, I'd been coming to Blue Ridge for about 4 years. I'd take them to the back just for the social interaction. It was good for the kids to be here. You know, I kind of adopted the theory, last in, first out type of thing, and I wasn't looking to try to move towards God. I was just going through the routine. And as I sat there and I always questioned, growing up in that environment, you know, am I really a child of God's? You know, because when you go to church on Sunday morning, then you live a different life for the next 6 days out of the week, I always would question where I was really at with God. And so about a year and a half ago, Peggy was up here on stage, and she was given an invitation for a new Seekers class that they were getting ready to start. And I knew in my heart that a Seekers class was for people that weren't Christ followers yet, that still had questions about Christianity, and this was a place that they could go and kind of get their questions answered in a kind of an informal setting. But one thing she said when she gave the invitation, she said that the Seekers class was also for people who have never had a relationship with God, that wanted to have a relationship with God, that this might be a class for them. And so I was sitting in the back of the auditorium, and I remember thinking, well, I'm a Christian, gone to church all my life, grew up in a Christian home. I said, but I've never had this relationship part of what she was talking about. So I thought I would go to the Seekers class to see if I could learn more about that. And so as I went into the Seekers class, again, I was thinking, all right, my prayer going in was, all right, God, tell me where I'm really at with you. Am I a child of yours or am I not? And so as I started going through over the first couple of weeks, God was faithful in allowing me to examine the motives behind the decisions and things I was making. You see, kind of going back through my teenage years and even into my early adult life, it was easy to look back and see a lot of the poor decisions you're making, a lot of the bad choices and the way you're living. It was easy to look back and say, all right, if those are the decisions and the actions you're doing, you must not be a Christ follower. But after getting married and settling down for the last 8 or 9 years of my life, I started making a lot of good choices. It wasn't quite as clear. But he allowed me to see that even in my motives behind even the good choices I was making, that they didn't have anything to do about him. See, the decisions I was making, they had to do with how people would perceive me, what was the right decision to do for the group at large. They didn't have anything to do with I loved God or I was trying to be obedient because I was a child of his. He allowed me to see that even in good decisions and right decisions, the motives behind what I was doing were still self-serving to me. And even taking that a little bit further, if you think about motives, you know, motives are really a pretty strong indicator of where your heart's at. And through that motives and him allowing me to see where my heart was at, he allowed me to see that my heart wasn't with him. And so I came to the conclusion over those first several weeks that I wasn't a child of his. And I thought, okay, well, once I realized that it would probably be an easy fix. I'd say a prayer like I'd done before, and we'd move on. But I didn't have any desire to want to even do anything about it. So I kept coming to the Seekers groups over the next several weeks. And the next thought that ran into my mind was, well, what's going to make this time any different than any other time? You know, I'd walked an aisle before. I sat in a chair when they'd given an invitation, said a prayer to myself when things were going bad in my life without any change. And so I thought, well, I'm not in any hurry to make a public spectacle out of myself and say I've had this change and have a 2 or 3 week emotional high just to have it go back to the same old thing like it had before. So I kept coming, and I remember it was a Thursday night. I went home. It was after the Seekers class, and it was about 2 o'clock in the morning. And I remember waking up and God saying to me, he says, it's going to be different this time, Ron, because you can't be spiritually lazy. I don't think like that. I don't even use those type of words. And so the thought that kept running through my mind is the way it's going to be different this time is you can't be spiritually lazy. For you to have a relationship with me is going to take some sort of action on your part. You're just not going to step across that line, go back to the same old way of living, and we're going to have this great relationship going forward. And even if you think about that in human terms, you think about having a relationship, it takes two people to have a relationship. And if only one person's putting in effort towards a relationship, it's really not much of a relationship. And so he answered the second question by saying, the way it's going to be different this time is you can't be spiritually lazy once you step across that line with me. And the thing was, even though he had kind of answered that second question over the next several weeks, I still didn't have any want to or any desire to even step across that line and fix it. So I kept coming to the Seekers class, and they go through the book of John in the Seekers class, and we got up to where we were going through John chapter 5. In John chapter 5, they talk about the invalid at the pool. This man had been at the pool for 38 years and couldn't physically walk. And Jesus approached the man and he asked him if he wanted to be made well. And the man said yes. And so he said, why don't you pick up your mat and walk? And so the man picked up his walk and he was able to physically walk. And I remember driving home that night from Seekers class thinking, you know what, Ron, you've been a spiritual invalid for 35 years of your life. Just pick up your mat and walk. You see, he had been faithful and he'd answered the question, was I a Christian? And the answer was no. And my next thought was, how's it going to be different? And he said, you can't be spiritually lazy. And still not having this desire to want to do anything, he said, just pick up your mat and walk, Ron. Just step across that line. But even after he laid out even a third piece of the puzzle, I still didn't have any want to fix it. In fact, quite the opposite started happening. I remember I started getting really cold towards God. I actually started skipping a bunch of Seekers classes right after that. You know, I was coming to church again, but it was kind of like prior to starting the Seekers class. I was, last in, first out. I was just here for the kids, wasn't looking, to move towards God at all. And I started getting real distant. And I remember it was December 11, 2005, and Peggy came up and she grabbed me before one of the services, and she said, hey, how you doing? I remember I hadn't seen her for several weeks because I was skipping. And she said, how you doing? And I said, I'm doing good. And she said, no, how you really doing? And I said, well, I've maybe regressed a little bit. And I remember even saying it kind of maybe even cocky or arrogant to her because I really didn't care where I was at that point. And so we stepped out into the hallway a little bit, and we started talking, and she said, hey, if you get some time this week, maybe you could stop over to church and maybe we could just get together and pray a little bit, and I can pray for you. And I thought that was a nice gesture on her part, and I thought, okay, I can do that. So I slipped back into the service, and she went on about her business. And as the service went on, near the end of the service, I remember I started kind of getting a little bit emotional. I don't know why. I guess I was thinking back about the way God had laid out the three different pieces of the puzzle for me, but I still didn't have this want to or desire to do it. But I started feeling these strong emotions to the point where it almost started feeling like an anxiety attack, where I just wanted to get out of the room. And so I slipped back out of the room into the hallway where we'd been earlier that morning, and I couldn't shake the emotion that was going on. And I was having this kind of a conflict in my head. One side of me was saying, Ron, you're being ridiculous, you're blowing this thing out of proportion. And the other side of me was saying, well, why don't you just go find Peggy this morning and pray? It doesn't need to wait till later this week. And so I sat out there with those two thoughts in my mind, kind of playing back and forth for about 4 or 5 minutes. And I finally decided, okay, well, I'll just go find Peggy and we'll pray now. And so I walked out into the foyer area, and I found Shay, and she was there, and she went and found Peggy for me. And we went up to the conference room, and we were going to pray, and she said, I'll pray for you, and she said, when I'm done, she says, either you can pray or I can lead you in a prayer, and I said, okay. And so she prayed, and when she got done praying, she said, do you want to pray? And I said, no, I'm not ready. I don't want to pray. You see, I said, because you got to remember, for me, the thought was I still had a fear of what was going to make this time any different. I said, I don't want to make a decision out of emotion. I said, because if I make a decision out of emotion, I'll get that 2 or 3 week kind of high, and then it's going to go back to the same old thing. I said, I need to go home, and I need to think through this thing logically. And I thought if I came to a decision logically, that it would be something that would stick a little bit more permanently. And so I said, no, I'm not, I don't want to make a decision out of emotion. So I went and got the kids, and we jumped in the car, and we drove home. And I remember driving all the way home. I still couldn't shake some of the emotions that I was feeling as I drove home. And we got home, and I went inside, and I ran upstairs, and I grabbed my Bible, and I opened it back up to John chapter 5, and I read back through the chapter where he was saying, just pick up your mat and walk. And I came back downstairs, and I told my wife, I said, I got to head back over to church. And she was like, what do you need to go back over to church for? And I didn't even want to tell her why I was thinking about coming back over to church, because at that point I still wasn't even sure I was going to make it all the way back over here, as I was still having this battle going on in my mind. And so I just said, I'll tell you when I get back. And so I jumped in the car, and I was coming back, and sure enough, all the way over, again, I'm so logical, I was sitting there thinking, Ron, you're blowing this thing out of proportion, you look stupid. And I thought one thing that might help me actually get all the way back over here was I called up and I talked to someone at the front desk, and because the second service was probably getting close to letting out, and I didn't know what time they'd be leaving, and I called up and I said, hey, can someone just let Peggy know if she's still over there to just hang around, that I'm coming back over, I wanted to talk. And so I come all the way back over here, and I get in the parking lot, and I still sit out there for about another 10 minutes just deciding, do I really want to go in and do what I think I'm going to do? And I finally decided I would, and so I walk in, and I find Peggy, and so we go back up into the conference room where we'd been. And, through all the emotion and through all the logical, just kind of back and forth as I was kind of battling in my mind if this was the decision I wanted to make, we finally went up to the conference room that day, and I finally picked up my mat that morning, and I walked, and I accepted Christ into my heart. And I told you when I was there earlier that morning that I didn't want to, the first time we went up to the conference room, that I didn't want to make a decision out of emotion. But what I've learned in hindsight a lot of times is that God is an emotional God, and He does allow us to feel those emotions, and sometimes when He's letting us feel those emotions, that's Him kind of tugging at us saying, come on, Ron, just step across that line. But I didn't know that at the time. But on that December 11th morning when I came back for the second time, I did step across that line, and I accepted Christ into my heart. And even though that was the story that I was experiencing on that Sunday morning, the things that were going on in my life, there's a whole other side of the story, the things that were happening that Sunday morning that I didn't know anything about until after the fact. And that's kind of what Peggy's experience was as she went through after she talked to me that morning when we stepped out into the hallway. And so she's going to come up now, and she's just going to share the experience she had.